All right, so we are on to our Article 5 debate discussion. We've got 3 people up here, which is not usually the way it is. Usually you've got one on each side. So before I introduce them, let me just explain a little bit about why we have 3 people. So we have a person who is opposed to an Article 5 convention. We have a person who supports it. And then we have Bill Norton, whom you all know and love, who is, through his research, if you remember, Tea Party Patriots did a webinar series, a symposium on the Article 5 convention where we had people from both sides come on to different webinars and explain their points of view. And through that, Bill did a lot of research on it, and through his research, he found that he actually was sympathetic to both sides. So he understands the arguments on both sides and actually can sympathize with a lot of the arguments on both sides. And he comes at this from an unalienable rights perspective, which is kind of, you don't usually see in one of these debates. And so while he personally leans toward having an Article 5 convention, he is sympathetic and does understand and thinks that the people who are opposed to it have valid points. And so it should be kind of interesting to have that extra perspective in this discussion. So let me introduce our other guests. Right next to me here is Senator Andy Biggs from Arizona. Andy is a retired attorney. He's licensed to practice in Arizona, Washington, and New Mexico. He has a bachelor's degree in Asian Studies from BYU and a JD degree from the University of Arizona. He earned a MA in Political Science from ASU and has done additional graduate work there. Andy serves as the president of the Arizona State Senate. In addition to his role as Senate President, Senator Biggs chairs the Rules Committee. Andy has earned the designation Champion of the Taxpayer from Americans for Prosperity for his cumulative service in the state legislature, has been honored numerous times by the Goldwater Institute as a Friend of Liberty, and has received the Goldwater Institute as a Friend of Liberty, and has received the Guardian of Small Business Award from NFIB for his career-long championing of small business interests. Senator Andy Biggs is an Arizona native and has lived in Gilbert with his family since 1986. He's married to Cindy, and they have 6 children. And Andy is here representing the opposition to an Article 5 convention, correct? Okay. And on the other side of Bill, we have Ilya Shapiro, and let me just grab this bio here. Ilya Shapiro is a senior fellow in constitutional studies at the Cato Institute and editor-in-chief of the Cato Supreme Court Review. Before joining Cato, he was a special assistant advisor to the multinational force in Iraq on rule of law issues and practiced international, political, commercial, and antitrust litigation at Patton Boggs and Cleary Gottlieb. Shapiro is the co-author of Religious Liberties for Corporations, Hobby Lobby and the Affordable Care Act, and the Constitution. He has contributed to a variety of academic, popular, and professional publications. He also regularly provides commentary for various media outlets. Shapiro has provided testimony to Congress and state legislatures, and as coordinator of Cato's Amicus Brief program, filed more than 100 Friend of the Court briefs in the Supreme Court. He lectures regularly on behalf of the Federalist Society and other groups, is a member of the Legal Studies Institute's Board of Visitors at the Fund for American Studies, was an inaugural Washington Fellow at the National Review Institute, and has been an adjunct professor at the George Washington University Law School. He holds an AB from Princeton University, an MSc from the London School of Economics, and a JD from the University of Chicago Law School. Welcome, Ilya. And Ilya's here representing the supporting the idea of an Article 5 convention position. And I'm not going to introduce Bill because you all know him and you've seen a lot of him already. So, and we love him. So how we're going to start out is each of them will have a 5-minute introduction, and then we'll come back together. I'll moderate some questions and discussion, and then for about a half an hour, and then we'll throw it open to the audience to ask questions for about a half an hour as well. So we'll go ahead.
I'll start.
Okay.
Since I'm proposing something, I suppose I should start. Thank you very much for having me. I know you all are the shock troops, or at least the colonels of the shock troops, as it were, in our attempt to take back the country. So I commend your efforts to do so. I'm here, I'm on the advisory board of the Compact for America, which is one proposal for amending the Constitution, but I want to speak more broadly. I want to tell you why we are in such a bad shape, why amending the Constitution is necessary, and then a little bit about the Compact for America as what I think to be the best way of amending the Constitution. So, as you all know, the budget is exploding. Spending keeps going up, regardless of whether taxes are stalled or the rate of increase doesn't go up or the increase in the rate of increase doesn't go up. It's kind of these accounting second derivative tricks that the Treasury Department does sometimes. The Supreme Court does not enforce, with rare exception, the structural limitations on the federal government. And politicians generally don't take seriously their oath to make sure that whatever they're voting for isn't just good policy, but is actually constitutional. And so, specifically with the size of government, I think if we could reduce that, that would, back to something approaching its constitutional justifications, I think that would help out on everything else that ails our country. And to that end, the Constitution provides a solution. I mean, my perspective on constitutional amendments is generally, well, all we need is to put after every sentence in the Constitution, and we mean it. And that's really all you need. But because over decades and decades, the jurisprudence has, constitutional law has gone away so much from the Constitution, I think it's time to have an amendment, and specifically a balanced budget amendment, among others that could limit federal power. There are different types of balanced budget amendments that could be passed. I'm not an economist. I haven't tinkered with that sort of language, but let me tell you that the Constitution's Article 5 process for amending the Constitution isn't something to be scared of. Indeed, like the rest of the Constitution, it's meant to be honored. The framers recognized that when we ran into trouble, as things changed, as history developed, it might be necessary to tweak the Constitution in certain ways, as has been done 27 times in our history. Unfortunately, during the New Deal, one of the bad things about the New Deal that you might not realize is that in enacting all of the otherwise unconstitutional federal programs directly through the legislature and then cowing the Supreme Court to approve them, FDR did great damage to Article 5, such that now we think, oh, Article 5 is only reserved for liberating slaves or giving the vote to women or maybe one day repealing the income tax like we repealed prohibition. But actually, it's for calibrating government in any way that a sustained majority, a supermajority of the American people think is merited. And there are many ways of doing that. I mean, most obviously, you start with whether the Congress proposes the amendment or the states. And Article 5 provides for how that happens. If there's enough states to call for an amending convention, Congress has to call that. Now, that has never happened in our history because all of the times when enough states have gathered the political momentum to do that, Congress jumps in front and says, oh, this might be dangerous, we will just initiate it ourselves, we'll propose the amendment that seems to be popular in the states, and then it gets ratified afterwards. I imagine the same thing would happen with a balanced budget amendment or any other kind to limit the federal government. But it's important that states do initiate that, and there are all sorts of limitations and restrictions that can be put in place, safeguards to prevent runaway conventions, to prevent discussions on things that wasn't the intent of the states. The Compact for America, for example, there are at least 17 safeguards. I'm not going to tick them off for you. If you're really curious, you can go to compactforamerica.org. But it involves, strict rules about who's appointed, what the subject matter is, what the text of the amendment to be voted on is, what to do when there's rogue states or rogue delegates. And at the end of the day, remember, anything coming out of an amending convention, even one that's open-ended, has to be ratified by the country. If 3/4 of state legislatures around the country are ready to ratify the 1978 USSR Constitution, we've already lost, and y'all are wasting your time doing here. You should be out with the survivalists. So that's what I have to say, and I look forward to further discussion, both broadly about the Article 5 and more specifically about the Compact for America. Thank you.
I'll be fair and wait till my timer starts here. Well, I think the best way to kind of begin this is to let you know how I kind of evolved through this discussion. You know, Benjamin Franklin at the Constitutional Convention made the comment toward the end that he didn't think that the Constitution was perfect in every way, but then he said that, you know, the longer he lives, the more he realizes that he needs to rely upon the wisdom of others, and that sometimes he can be wrong. And that was actually surprising coming from Benjamin Franklin, because he was not only correct about a lot of things, but he was also let people know that he believed he was correct about those things. And so when I approach an issue, I try to get into it and try to be as open-minded as possible, though I am very opinionated. And so as I've done the research, my views of an Article 5 have evolved. In fact, if many of you recall, about 3 years ago, maybe 3.5 years ago, we Tea Party Patriots was helped sponsor a conference at Harvard University regarding an Article 5. And Tea Party Patriots took a neutral position on it, but I was one of the speakers there, and I was a speaker on the con side. We also invited Senator Biggs. He was there on the con side as well. And at that time, my speech, the reason why I said I was against an Article 5 was because I didn't think that the people were educated enough in fundamental natural law principles. And maybe we would be ready for an Article 5 in the future, but at the time I didn't think we were prepared for it because we didn't understand natural law principles. And so as I was studying actually some other things, in fact, when I was helping CSG and helping some of the stuff there, getting their curriculum going, we kept going back to this quote from Thomas Jefferson. And suddenly, when I applied it to my view on Article 5, it was a stinging rebuke from Jefferson. He said, "I know no safe depository of the ultimate powers of society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with wholesome discretion," and that's where my view was. I didn't think that the people were enlightened enough to exercise their control with wholesome discretion. So Jefferson said, if we don't think that, or if we think that they are not enlightened enough, he said, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education. This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power. At that point, I started reevaluating my views, and I realized, who am I to say that the people aren't ready? Who am I to think that the people don't understand fundamental principles or can't come to those conclusions? And even if I do believe that, the remedy isn't to take the freedom from them, but to simply educate them. And so I started realizing that perhaps an Article 5 process would actually be a great education tool in which the people could be enlightened. And so I began evaluating, more and more my view on those things, and realized that perhaps the people could be trusted. And as I started studying Thomas Jefferson even more, when Jefferson talks about how, one of the quotes that I used yesterday was Speaking the Language of Liberty, where Jefferson talks about how even in their errors, the people can have a positive effect if they are actively engaged in their government, because they are their government's only censors. And so it made me realize that right or wrong, the people need to be engaged, because we are the ones that keep the government in check. And we look at one of the major problems that we face in our country today. We have the three big issues that cause serious problems in our country. All happened in 1913, right? Federal Reserve, 16th Amendment income tax, 17th Amendment direct election of senators. And we look at each one of those. They destroyed federalism. We have not exercised federalism in a meaningful way in 100 years. And an Article 5 convention would reinstitute an exercise of federalism. So the founders understood this principle of federalism and recognized the importance of this vertical separation of power. But we've gotten away from that. But an exercise of the people and the state legislatures getting together to have an Article 5 convention would be an exercise of federalism at a level that we haven't had in 100 years. Just that exercise alone, even if we had a poor amendment come out of it, would have a positive effect because it would keep the federal government in check. That's kind of some of my evolution and why I agree with an Article 5, but I also believe that an Article 5 convention cannot be limited, and I believe that it could be a runaway, and I believe that it could be disastrous. But I believe that the positive effects outweigh the risk. And so we're looking forward to more of an open discussion as we continue on the next hour.
Morning. Pleasure to be with you. I appreciate what you do. To affect races, political campaigns all over the country. In reality, we have a lot in common, even though I oppose vehemently the Article 5 convention. So I'm going to just begin by just iterating some of the things that we have in common, some of the ideas I think that we agree on. For instance, Americans are free no longer. We're no longer governed, we are ruled. We cannot expect equal treatment before the law, although we ought to be. Our right to succeed now comes with constraints that are imposed by a degenerate governmental leader. Our congressional leaders are feckless, more concerned with perpetuating their position than our freedom. And our current president has clearly stated that he doesn't care what the constitutional boundaries of his authority are. He habitually exceeds them. Congress does not act to constrain him. States are helpless and inert after being bought off by the national government for years. They are now incapable of exercising their sovereignty. Choose willfully not to exercise their sovereignty. Our president is content. In fact, he is actually working assiduously to perpetuate the decline of America internationally and domestically. He presides over the nationalization of American health care. He rules over the further nationalization of American education. He instructs his agencies to disregard federal laws. State laws are attacked in the courts by his accomplices, the Department of Justice. He has successfully enacted the substance of foreign treaties without the constitutional approval of the U.S. Senate by ordering his departments and agencies to act in certain ways that are consistent with those treaties. And in so doing, he is driving a radical agenda that is now and will cripple the American economy. He's aggressively dismantling the entire America. We all agree to these ideas. Our national deficit mounts daily, and our national debt will never be retired. Nearly half of all Americans receive some direct welfare benefit from the government. That burden is imposed on a shrinking workforce and a minority of Americans who pay income tax. State and local pensions are driving cities and towns into bankruptcy. Similarly, America's social welfare payments to those on the dole are crushing. Perhaps that's why so many of the elected elite of both parties is pushing for legalization of illegal immigrants. Without the illegal migrant, they tell us, how will we pay for these entitlement programs? American foreign policy is confused and immature in its outlook. We now watch as gains we have made are surrendered with a series of stern warnings and finger wagging. Our historic allies wonder if America can be counted on any longer. Freedom-loving people throughout the world and here at home have lost their city shining on the hill. A terrible shadow is falling across America's path. There are many who wonder if that shadow can be removed by the light of a renewed freedom movement in America, or whether the shadow will melt into the dark night as the great beacon of freedom collapses. Ultimately, cast into this milieu, many are searching for answers. Freedom-loving people, those who understand that freedom is individuated and not collective in nature, seek restoration of basic freedom. Many, including myself, look to the founders for guidance, the Declaration of Independence, and the U.S. Constitution for a path to restoration. We share, everybody here, you wouldn't be here, you share those deep frustrations. But I'm going to ask several questions based on what I just heard and what I hear continually, because I see a seemingly endless parade of people coming to my office asking for me to support an Article 5 convention. That happens all the time. My opposition to that does not take freedom away, contrary to the implication of my moderate friend here, Bill Norton. Why do you believe that changing the Constitution fixes those deep-seated problems I just said? I just iterated. It is not the Constitution that is the problem. It is the people. It is the people who refuse to adhere to the barriers that are parchment barriers, as Madison called them, in the Constitution today. What do you think the process of amending the Constitution initiated by the states will look like? A lot of people will tell you about the actual proposing convention. But what about the application process? What about the referral process, the call process? What about the process of the convention itself? And what will you do in the ratification process? What do you think those will look like? If you think a convention cannot be hijacked, then why have I noticed a tremendous number of attempts to rein in delegates and limit the purpose of a convention? In fact, 17 from Ilya's point of view from his organization. And how high do you think parchment barriers need to be, especially in light of the fact that many of the people in government ignore the barriers that are already in place? Those are a few questions I suggest we try to answer today. And in the end, I suggest that there are other avenues we should take to correct America's path. The risk of undesirable outcomes arising from an Article 5 process outweigh potential benefits. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's start out with actually one of your questions, Senator Biggs. I think that I liked the question of, if you think a convention cannot be hijacked, then why have supporters of amending the Constitution produced a tremendous number of measures in an attempt to rein in delegates and limit the purpose of a convention? So I think that would be a good question.
Sure.
Ilya.
Well, Reagan used the old Russian aphorism. I was born in Russia, and I'm a naturalized immigrant. You know, like most immigrants, I do a job that native-born Americans won't, defending the Constitution. Ronald Reagan used the old Russian adage, trust but verify, right? I don't think a convention can be hijacked, and it's irrelevant if it is, because a hijacked amendment would never be ratified. But why not put in safeguards to just make the system more streamlined and efficient and dissuade anyone who would even want to start hijacking and nip that in the bud. Call it over-lawyering, call it belt and suspendering, but if you want a precise, effective amendment, you lawyer it up and you make rules and you think about all possible contingencies.
Anybody else want to comment?
Yeah, I'll comment. The reason I think you see that they're putting that these different organizations, and there's three main organizations, and there's countless other fractionalized organizations, want to now address the hijacking. When Bill and I were at the Harvard debates, the other side at that point was firmly convinced that you could not hijack a convention. That was their stated understanding. They've now changed and modified. And the reason is because as we begin to look at it, it isn't just a convention that you have to dealing with a whole process, a whole series of things. And I'll just tell you this, if you're relying on the states, then you've never watched the state legislatures in action. I happen to be very intricately involved with one of those state legislatures. Many of you would agree, or think anyways, that Arizona is probably one of the most conservative states in the country. You need to be there and watch what we have to deal with. Because, for instance, the Obamacare expansion. What did you see happen? You saw 13 Republicans in the Senate hold firm, saw a small clique go over with the Democrats and force, they voted to suspend all rules in both houses. And then the government attempted to take out leadership who were conservative in both houses so they could get Obamacare expansion. This is what you see happening in state legislatures. I talked to my colleagues. They face similar problems, see coalitions together. I don't know if you can actually trust state legislatures to do the right thing, even though it takes only a small number of states. So, it's problematic.
So James Madison said that men are not angels, so that's why we need government. And he said if we didn't if men were angels, then we wouldn't need government at all. And so, of course, the state legislatures can't be trusted in many things, but the point is not whether or not a government body can be trusted. The founders set up a system of checks and balances. And the point was to get a body of government that you can't trust to have a check and a balance against another body of government that we can't trust. And so they keep each other in check. So it's not a question of whether or not the state legislatures are good or bad. We've always had bad government. It's a matter of getting that check and balance between the federal government and the state governments. So if we were to, for example, repeal the 17th Amendment, would we say, no, let's not repeal it because we don't want the states to have a veto power in the Senate because we can't trust the state governments? Absolutely, we don't want that. We want to repeal the 17th Amendment so that they can have that veto power, so that the states can have that opposition against the federal government. Whether the states are good, bad, corrupt, statesmen, whatever, it doesn't matter. That federalism works because of the checks and balances.
If I can say one thing on the 17th Amendment, kind of going a little just for 1 minute away from the broad Article 5 thing, just to caution you, I favor repealing the 17th Amendment. I think it's better to kind of rebalance political power in that way. But for practical purposes, I'm not sure it would do a lot of work compared to other potential proposals, both in terms of the constitutional amendment and in terms of using the political process. Because even before the 17th Amendment, about half the state legislatures were simply ratifying the choices of the people in popular elections anyway. And I think it would be very hard to move back to a place, given the political dynamics, where the state legislature would actually be choosing people rather than simply ratifying the non-binding, in that event, referenda or straw polls, effectively, for Senate. So yeah, I support, at the margins it might help a little bit, but it's not a panacea in terms of restoring federal-state balance.
So tune in 6 months when we have a debate on the 17th Amendment.
So, Ilya, you said something that I thought was interesting that I never really thought about. You said that FDR did great damage to Article 5. Could you explain how?
Sure. By ramming through all of these facially unconstitutional things, some of which were popular, some of which were not, he set a precedent that even fundamental structural changes to the government, to the federal government, to federal-state relations, or among the branches, didn't need a constitutional amendment. Indeed, he and his inner circle knew that a lot of these things were constitutionally dicey, to put it in its most positive light. He wrote the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, a committed Democrat, that he shouldn't let any doubts about the constitutionality of these measures, however reasonable, to prevent him from approving this legislation. And that goes from public works programs to, say, something like Social Security. And think about it, in that time when Social Security started, it was for widows and orphans. And you think something like that in the depths of the Great Depression wouldn't have been overwhelmingly popular such that we could have had a constitutional amendment to that effect? And if it wasn't, well, then doubly so, it shouldn't have been done. But if you want to abide by the rule of law, it's much better, even if we didn't change a thing of what the government does now, if we amended the Constitution to allow it to do those things, we'd be better off, because at least then the government would be acting pursuant to the Constitution. And so FDR, by doing these plainly extra or unconstitutional things without amending the Constitution, set the precedent that you never amend the Constitution unless it's something really drastic, like I said, like giving women the vote or liberating slaves or limiting the terms of the president, something really incredible like that. And so we need to be wary and never amend it otherwise.
Can I just
Yeah, please comment.
talk about that? Because
And I think that mic is a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll just hold
That's what I
my
had.
tie like
I had
this.
that.
It's,
We wanted to set it up so Andy looked as awkward as possible.
and usually that doesn't take much for me to look awkward, but pregnant in Ilya's statement regarding FDR is the idea that if you have a constitutional amendment process, that you will actually begin restraining the federal government. I want to make two comments to that. Most of the effort that we see in an Article 5 movement is dealing with a balanced budget effort. Okay? So, and that's because most of the focus is on what Congress does in exceeding its bounds. But we know that the executive, as Ilya has pointed out, clearly and often exceeds his bounds. We know that one of the biggest problems is that we don't really have three branches of government anymore. We have four. We have added the administrative bureaucratic branch of government. That is probably the largest offender in killing our constitutional rights. We know that the judiciary, I mean, we have Supreme Court justices now who believe that you should turn to international law in interpreting our constitutional applications. So the fact that FDR caused these problems by showing a path is fine, and to make the argument. But a balanced budget amendment, which is the direction that this is going, is not enough. And so that's why we see literally on my desk at home in excess of 65 different proposed amendments. So that you see this shotgun approach to reforming this very structure of American government. And the second thing I would say is, it wasn't just FDR. I think American President Theodore Roosevelt really laid the groundwork for the strong executive when he said, when he took the position that he wasn't going to feel constrained by something because it wasn't in the Constitution. He would feel only limited in the sense that he couldn't find something in the Constitution. In other words, he could do anything in the world he wanted unless he found a specific negative in the Constitution. That was his argument. So this is what we face today, is the path that he put us on. FDR just expanded on it. Now you have a current executive. You have a current executive that's gone way beyond that today. So the constitutional proposals that are out there today, in my opinion, are short. Now I want to make one more comment because the idea that you have a tool in the Constitution, Article 5, does not mean that this is the time. If you were in a sinking lifeboat and you found a drill, it would not be the time to start drilling holes in your lifeboat. And that's kind of what we're doing here. As Bill has pointed out, we've got to educate our citizenry, and you participate in that. We are facing virtually 100 years of a progressive movement. We have an education establishment that no longer even values or even understands natural rights. When we got to Oliver Wendell Holmes in the teens of the last century, and he wrote in an opinion that we do not recognize natural rights, you changed the very nature of what our constitutional predicates were, which is that we each have inherent God-given rights, not given to us by government, only protected and recognized by government.
I have a question then. How do we know when we've read it, in your opinion, if we're not at the point yet where we're ready for it, how do we know when people are ready for it? Like, what's the line that we cross? And does the bell ding? I mean, so what's the...
It sounds like you're saying, like, balanced budget won't do everything, which nobody claiming it will, and therefore we shouldn't do anything.
No, okay, so two separate questions. Let's take yours, balanced budget, first, because I really like that question. Because
we can discuss other amendments.
Well, yeah, there's lots of other amendments that people have proposed, but the balanced budget is the one that I think you'd agree most people are focusing on. My favorite was I had a group come into my office from a competing group to Ilya's group. And they want a balanced budget amendment, and they want to... I said, well, what's your language look like? They said, well, we're relying upon the 49 state legislatures, state constitutions or governments have some kind of balanced budget constriction. I said, well, what language do you like best? And they just looked at me, and I said, well, surely you've read these, and so which of the language works and which doesn't work? Well, we're working on that, they said. So I said, you're going around the country telling people we need to have a balanced budget amendment. You're relying on the language of states and you're telling me you don't know which language works, because Arizona has that. And guess what? We have $1 billion deficit. Because you can't, every legislative body will find some way to poke holes through it. And it is not corrected. It's not self-correcting. And so you have to be very careful. And I asked the guy in that same group, I said, well, what will you do? Let's presume that you get your favorite constitutional amendment. What do you think Congress will do as soon as that is ratified? Without missing a beat, he said, they will immediately try to poke holes in it and go around it. It is not the corrective. I just think philosophically that's the wrong avenue. I do agree with Bill. If you were going to do such a thing, it would be a 17th Amendment repeal, it would be a 16th Amendment repeal, because all of a sudden, at least your federal legislators would at least once in a while have to come home and report to state policymakers what they're doing to them in Washington. So at least you'd have something there. Now, to answer your question, which is how will you know? Well, you will know that you're about ready when a couple things happen. You will have several governors in your country will say, we are going to resist federal mandates. We are going to refuse to take federal money and the constraints that come with it. As soon as you start seeing that happen, you can know that perhaps the tide is beginning to turn. We introduce that in my body every year. There are several of us that try to do that. We can't get it done. I think once you start seeing that happen with the state legislative bodies, you can begin to say, we've made a difference. It may be time that we can safely hold a convention, because you might have enough states who will say no to some, it isn't just a balanced budget amendment that will be proposed. There'll be many, and some of them will reflect maybe a Soviet type of a state progressive ideal, and we need to know that our states are going to be able to say no. That would be my basic thing.
About half the states have refused Obamacare money to expand Medicaid. You described what happened in Arizona and the hijacking there by the rhinos. But half the states have refused that. So some states don't take federal money of various kinds. Texas is the leader in rejecting the money and the strings that comes with it from the federal government to do various things. 2 governors, 2 states have already joined the compact that the organization that I advise, Alaska and Georgia, and more states are on the way this year. So states are pushing back in a whole host of areas. It just seems to me just to say that we should only resort to Article 5 when we're otherwise dead. Well, I think that's too late. And if we want to discuss what the full complement of amendments that are needed, I'm happy to deal with that. Randy Barnett, the noted constitutional scholar at Georgetown, had an influential piece a few years ago called The Bill of Federalism. A whole host of amendments, including things like if a majority of states legislatures vote, they can repeal federal law or federal regulations. A whole host of mechanisms to rebalance federal-state relations, citizen-federal government relations, rebalance the branches, curtail executive power, the administrative agencies. By no means am I, at least, maybe there's some people who might think that the balanced budget amendment is the cure-all that'll do everything. But that's sort of, the first thing. You stop the bleeding, perhaps, and then you can start pushing back on some of these other things. But that's too bad that the group that saw you had no idea what they actually were for in terms of because there are many competing types of languages that are being offered on the balanced budget. That's not even the most significant bit. And here we're debating whether to amend in the first place. The language, if someone wants to debate that, well, the compact's language isn't as good as this language, that's fine. We can have that talk. But again, I think it's productive to say that we can impose these bounds. And it's not about picking up a drill in your lifeboat, but you have lots of different cups available. We can't decide which cup is the best, therefore we shouldn't bail at all.
Bill, go ahead.
I think we've reached the exact threshold that Senator Biggs has just mentioned. Ilya mentioned a number of things. The state of Arizona, we just passed a proposition, the people did, saying that if there are federal mandates, then we are not to use elected officials, public officials, or money to put those or to enforce those federal mandates. We've got the governors that have gone against Obamacare. We've got nullification happening all over the place. While I do not want to see marijuana legalized in my community, we see this marijuana stuff happening all across the country. No federal law regarding marijuana has changed, but yet all these states are looking to the federal government saying, enough's enough. We are not going to be dictated by you in certain areas, so they're nullifying federal law. I think we are seeing those exact signs.
No, let's get the nomenclature right. They're not nullifying. Nullification died with, what's his name? Sorry? What? Calhoun. Sorry, yes. I love giving this talk in South Carolina because I feel like the ghost of Calhoun is haunting me or something. But yes, states cannot nullify federal law. Now, some federal laws might be unconstitutional, and states can sue to prevent them from being imposed, like what happened with the case that ended up being NFIB versus Sebelius, the individual mandate litigation. But states cannot nullify federal law. There are some areas where states can legislate and set up test cases, effectively daring the federal government to come in and try to sue them to stop those laws. There's other areas where there might be concurrent jurisdiction, and sometimes there's tension, and you have to work out where is the proper jurisdiction of the feds and where is the proper jurisdiction of the states. But there's certainly room for state innovation. And by the way, it's already the law that the federal government cannot compel states to either their officials or their funds to enforce federal law or mandates. If you take federal money, then all bets are off. There's lots of strings and regulations attached to that. But under a principle that the Supreme Court announced over 20 years ago called anti-commandeering, the federal government cannot commandeer state officials or funds to do their bidding.
Just one little rebuttal to that. With regard to Obamacare expansion, you will see that there is still a push on in several states that they are going to go ahead and expand this coming legislative session. So you still haven't reached what I would say is critical mass on fighting back against the feds. And the second thing is, I would just point out the further nationalization of education. That continues to expand and grow, even though we have states that are attempting to fight back. I would talk about EPA statutes. EPA regulation, which in many states is actually shutting down generation plants, and there really ought to be nullification there. We ought to have states have their utilities keep those plants open because it will result in increased utility rates, suppressed economic development in those states. So there still is this continued fight where the federal government is actually expanding its mandates in the states. And the states, although they're fighting back, some of them, they're not able to succeed enough. But I don't believe you've reached critical mass to safely hold a convention.
Okay, related to that is a question or a criticism that you hear a lot, which Bill, I'd like you to address, which is you hear this question: how can we trust a convention in a day and age when we do not have Washingtons, Jeffersons, Madisons, and other great people like the founders?
So first of all, when you hear people say, we can't do a convention because we don't have any Washingtons, Jeffersons, Madisons, and others, first of all, I think that's a pretty arrogant statement, because who is that person that can decide whether or not there's Washingtons, Jeffersons, or Madisons? That person must believe that they are greater than a Madison or a Jefferson to be able to judge whether or not somebody else is a Jefferson or a Madison. But I also believe, as I mentioned yesterday, there are, as I've traveled around the country and met with thousands of great patriots across the country, there are Washingtons and Madisons and Jeffersons in the nation that I absolutely would trust. I mentioned to you yesterday, Mark Herr with the Center for Self-Governance is absolutely at that level. I would say my opponent at this time here, Andy Biggs, is absolutely at the level of a founding father. Senator Biggs and I are close friends. We go way back, and we agree on virtually everything except for this one issue. It's the only time he's been wrong. And so, but there's an amazing thing. Senator Biggs is the Senate President of Arizona, not because of corruption or deals that were cut. He was elected kind of unexpectedly initially as majority leader by merit. Now that's an amazing thing. It doesn't happen very often. So we were at the airport together a couple days ago, traveling here, and Senator Biggs is making some phone calls. And he's talking to people about, would you like to be on this committee chair, or would you like to stay in this chair, or whatever. Now, this is after the election. I want to point that out. It's after the election. What that means is that deals weren't cut prior to the election. And it's an amazing thing when you see a great statesman like that. So I'd have to say yes, there are Jeffersons and Madisons. I've met them. Got one sitting next to me here. I've got others that I've met. So like Jefferson said, he said, you know, I always fall back on being able to trust the people. They may be led astray from time to time, he said, but they will always come back to the right and to what's correct. So I think that it's, who are we to judge that there's not? And if there were, 55 great statesmen at the time when we only had 4 million people in the country, don't you think we can find 55 when we have 300 million? I absolutely believe mankind is great enough to have Jeffersons and Madisons in our day.
I don't think
something. Could I? Oh, go ahead.
I don't think it matters. I mean, this isn't about we need demigods to be able to amend the Constitution or who are wise enough to know what the correct path is. I mean, all of this, they're not infallible. And they didn't agree on everything for that matter. If we had Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton, Washington sitting here, they would each be debating with each other about all these different points. I think we have enough experienced people with the right intuitions and the right values. We have people with different types of skill sets to solve different types of problems. That's why any type of constitutional change requires supermajorities across the country, so that some brilliant Madison can't hijack the whole process himself because everyone will defer to him as a demigod. The people are meant to govern, and the people are ultimately in control of the Constitution. And so we may or we may not. The percentage of these demigod-type people might be lower or higher. They might be lost. Who knows? But it really doesn't matter, because part of self-governance is being able to use structures and procedures and empower lasting majorities who realize what the problems are, rather than kind of a magical deus ex machina to come down and fix everything.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question.
Can I just respond briefly?
Quickly.
2 points. Well, I can't respond quickly, but I will attempt to respond quickly. First of all,
if you really were a Madison, you could respond quickly.
No, you've apparently never read Madison's stuff and what people said about him. They think they said about Madison, he could take more words to say hello than anybody else. So the reality is, when Bill talks about the question that was just proposed, I think what we're really talking about is not necessarily whether we have a Madison or Jefferson. I think we're talking about what would a convention look like? What kind of delegates would you have at a proposal? And we know that Madison himself said that convention was held under the most propitious of circumstances. It was, everybody came in, you had a lot of people who were very familiar with the government. I'm not saying that you wouldn't have delegates that were qualified like that today. But they were able to close the doors and keep it secret. You will not be able to pry a smartphone away from any delegate's hand. You will have delegates tweeting out. You will have it, it's going to be an arena. You're going to have media, it's going to be a media circus. I won't go into what I think it will be, but I will just tell you, it will not be under the most propitious of circumstances. It will be contrary to that. And let me just touch on something Ilya said there. When he said every aspect of this is going to be met with supermajorities, that will be there. I agree with Colonel Mason, who spoke in the original convention, who said that isn't the case. He said the way that it's kind of drafted, one of his concerns was that you can actually have, and Sherman said this too from Connecticut, he said this too, you can actually have a minority of states control at a convention, a subsequent convention, because there's nothing, as Madison pointed out in the constitutional minutes, there is nothing in there that talks about what constitutes a quorum at that particular convention. So you can actually have any body that constitutes a quorum. It's a self-governing body. So they come in, they determine what the rules are. They set the rules. So they determine, just like any self-governing body, that they can amend the rules on a simple majority. We don't know that 2/3 of the states actually show up and participate in such a convention. So you can actually have a majority of those states, which constitutes a fraction of our states, which would be the quorum.
Can you address that, Ilya?
Okay,
the quorum question?
Yeah.
Well, sure. Delaware, New Jersey, and Rhode Island blow through all of the safeguards and have their own secret convention, decide that those 3 states each get 100 senators. Good luck getting that ratified in the rest of the country.
Yeah, maybe so, but what if they put out something, we're going to guarantee a living wage? You think that's not going to pass in virtually every state legislature? It's going to pass in virtually every state legislature. I can't think of more than maybe 3 or 4 that would say no.
Why hasn't it already passed in that many?
It is passing. It is passing. So I mean, the point is, you can take the most ridiculous outlier and say, as Mason did in the convention, he said, "I am concerned that 3/4 of the states could actually literally vote a state out of existence," which was a concern because there were territorial claims that states were trying to make. You can take that and say that you can make these outrageous claims, but how about simply much more moderate, progressive, statist types of policies?
And no courts would strike any of that down, even though that's plainly against the convention call and plainly against the rules that have been voted by the states. Well, no state attorney general would sue their own electors and get them declared invalid.
Tell me in Article 5 how it tells you how it calls to be issued. Tell me how an application should be determined. We have people we have literally hundreds of applications sitting in Congress today.
Look,
hundreds of them sitting there. And you ask people who support a convention, who determines the adequacy or sufficiency? They will say Congress. That isn't written in Article 5. And yet somehow, and besides that is not a ministerial function. What that is you are recognizing that Congress has a greater role in this than you otherwise would.
The Constitution provides for a lot of flexibility. You could have a completely open-ended convention. You could have a completely circumscribed one. You could have something in between. You write the rules. If people don't want to follow the rules, I mean, look, then we're already, if nobody in the country all of a sudden, if everybody woke up and decided we weren't going to follow anything anywhere, we're just not going to recognize any government, everyone comes to that agreement all at the same time, and we have this radical dystopia, that could happen too. But the point of the matter is, you write these rules, and sure, if everyone at the same time decides not to follow them, we're toast. But, we do this for a reason, and you have multiple fail-safes and safeguards and limitations, and again, depending on how you write the convention call, depending on what kind of sanctions there are for rogue states, rogue electors, and all the rest of it, you provide for judicial review as needed or not, depending, again, what the wise course is, and you do that. And if Congress decides to abolish everything and abolish elections and make themselves, a permanent committee of governance, they could do that too. But, that's such as life.
Okay, you comment, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions.
Yeah, okay, I'll just briefly respond. That when you start talking about conditional enactment, which is basically what your group is, conditional enactments are problematic because you're trying to just basically create in one nut how everything's going to happen. And I just don't think you can. So when you start talking about, I think you're self-contradictory when you say all these different things can happen, and yet we're going to try to cram it into a single nut. I think that's self-contradictory.
Okay, hold on. Maria, could you reset the timer for us, please, so we stay on track? And I want to make sure, hopefully there are going to be a balance of questions. If we are getting overwhelmingly from one side, I might ask if somebody from the other side has a question, just so that we can...
I'm Lisa Morris. I'm from Indiana, and my pro tem senator is leading the charge on this Article 5 convention. One of the most frightening things I think I heard back in June when I was at the State House listening to their second meeting on this was one of his assistants that said he got excited several years ago when he heard Senator Long, well, he asked Senator Long why he wanted to do this, and simply Senator Long said, because it's never been done. That frightened me. Secondly, excuse me, I'm very passionate about this subject. The second thing that frightened me was when all of the senators or the representatives from the various states came downstairs after the meeting and got off of the elevator. One of the first people to greet them clapping was our state representative for the Young Turks. I don't know if you're familiar with that group, but they are a progressive liberal group. There are many other things that came out of that meeting. One of them was, excuse me, when I sat there and listened, and you say there aren't many scholars or there are many that you would trust, there's not one of them in the room that I would have trusted. They couldn't even determine where to put a period or a comma. They spent an hour discussing that. I'm not confident. I believe that we should follow the Constitution as written.
Okay, make sure you guys that we can, if you want to comment, let's save comments for the open mic tomorrow. It's okay. But let's try to ask questions while we have our guests here.
Could I answer that question?
Sure.
So the thing is about the fears that we have. I'm with you. I don't believe that it can be limited, and I think that there are some safeguards in there as well. But look at what we have right now. We have a standing convention. Don't be mistaken to think that a convention doesn't exist. We have a standing convention. It's Congress. Congress can amend the Constitution anytime they want.
They can propose amendments.
They can propose the amendments. That's right. So they can propose these amendments. Now Congress is ignoring the Constitution. They are not all statesmen. They are, just like you said, you fear these people that are already in office. These are the people that were already saying, you are part of this open convention, Congress. So it doesn't make much sense to me that we are afraid of a convention, and instead of doing an Article 5 convention, we instead say, let's just stay with what we know is garbage, instead of going with something that might be garbage, but it could also have a positive effect. The fears that we have of Article 5 are already in existence with our standing convention with Congress. But what's the protection? They can amend them, or they can propose the amendments, but it still has to go to 3/4 of the states. So that's our protection against Congress right now with amending the Constitution. And we look at that, that's the only way the Constitution's ever been amended, is through Congress. And out of the 27 amendments, I would venture to say that over half of them are either poor amendments or badly crafted, even if they are good amendments. And so the process that we've used thus far hasn't been perfect. And so why do we fear doing something just because it's new, when the worst thing that will happen is the same thing that's already happening, right? Which is bad. But that's the worst thing that's going to happen, is the same thing that's already happened. But we have we have this ability to where we could possibly have a positive effect.
Okay, next question.
Good morning. Thank you for being here, gentlemen. I'm going to get to a question real quick here. But first, I'd like to make the statement that... Now, hang on a second, folks. Hang on. Senator, you're right. And that's the downfall of your argument. Ilya, you're failing to pick up on something. What an Article 5 convention would do is what we're trying to do. That would involve the electorate once again. It would get people excited. We're supposed to be controlling our state senate, our state houses, and the federal. You're exactly right, sir. If someone doesn't know how a state legislature works, they need to take a look. An Article 5 convention, and I'm going to ask if you would agree with this, do you feel it would not bring the people of this country to life?
Yeah, I mean, there would be obviously media attention to it, but I think for practical purposes, it wouldn't come to actually holding the convention, because as has happened time and again, as I said in my opening remarks, when there's enough political momentum coming from the states, Congress decides, oh, we need to get in front of this, and then Congress proposes the amendment. The same thing would happen here, and that's why this is such a positive force, because it's ideas for reform coming from the states that would be forced onto Congress, and that's the way that that change happens.
Well, two responses to that. Number one is that the country would probably get animated, as would all the special interest groups, all the people who hold power, all the media around the world. They'd all be animated because they have something at stake. I don't believe you can limit a convention to one subject matter. Even if you did and you were able to say it's going to be balanced budget, any person with any bit of intelligence can immediately run it off to another area. So it would animate. But I want to comment something that Ilya has said now twice, and I let the first one go, but I can't let the second one go, when he says time and again when there's been some kind of purpose in the states that Congress has responded. I can think of two. I can't think of time and again, I guess, unless time is one and again is two. But there have been a couple of them where Congress has responded. Neither one of them were good amendments. Neither one of them were good. And we are suffering under those particular amendments today. And so I think that just means.
Okay, next question, please.
Yes, Kelly from Indiana. Is this proposal, this Article 5 convention for amending amendments, is this coming from the citizens or the state legislature originally, legislatures? And also, could you speak about Dillon versus Gloss, the Supreme Court decision?
I'm not familiar with that case. Article 5, let me just read it to you so we're all, sometimes when I'm asked constitutional questions, I like to actually refer to the Constitution. It can be important.
That's weird.
Y'all can follow along if you. This is the Cato pocket Constitution. We don't leave any parts out. We don't add anything, and actually the Declaration's in there as well. So it's a twofer. I actually swore my wedding vows on a special one of these with our commemorative edition with our names and the date that we gave to all our guests. But anyhow, my wife's a very tolerant lady.
So is my husband.
The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, Congress shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states or by conventions in 3/4 thereof. So this comes, there are two ways to amend the Constitution. One is for Congress to propose an amendment and then the states ratify. One is for the states to call for an amendment, then Congress calls a convention, and then the states ratify or not, whatever comes out of that. And so the reason why there's an impetus to have state-based calls is because what's coming out of Congress isn't working. Just a couple of months ago, there was a failed constitutional amendment to limit the First Amendment, right? That didn't work. So hopefully things that the state legislatures can propose might work a little better and put heat on the federal government, on Congress.
Really quickly, just to follow on that, if the founders thought that there needed to be specific limitations because they were worried about some of the things that you've mentioned, why wouldn't they have put a little more detail in to limit it and prevent disaster? Why did they leave it so basic and simple and open?
Well, it's my opinion that the founders, in spite of what some people have said, that the idea of these types of conventions was so well known that they left this stuff out. But if you really closely examine the minutes of the Constitution, or the 1787 convention, you'll find that there were only two meaningful discussions regarding Article 5. And one was on September 10th and one was on September 15th. And you know that was right toward the end of the whole enchilada. And those basically, Madison himself said twice, he said, this article is vague. It doesn't cover forums, delegates, and he said, we really ought to take care of it. And Sherman raised his concerns, Mason raised his concerns, Elbridge Gerry raised his concerns, and also Alexander Hamilton. But Hamilton's position was, hey, you know what, let's just have, we should, he was arguing on one hand that we should eliminate the states, and then on the other hand, he was saying we should allow amendments at any time. My point would be, you had two very short debates right at the end of the convention, and I wouldn't say this was in as an afterthought, but they recognized that there was an anti-federalist idea, and they wanted to just cover it, so they just, it was just left vague because they didn't take enough time to handle it.
So one thing that we don't have a record of with the convention are the committees, at least as detailed a record as we have of the committee of the whole. And so, for example, the great compromise that Sherman came up with, that we don't have a tremendous amount of detail on how that exact compromise was developed by Sherman, because those kind of things took place in committee. So we don't know whether or not there was large debates on this issue in committee. It very well could have been. But I think that to say that the founders kind of threw it in there as an afterthought, when they had just spent 4 months, 4 heated months, talking about every minute detail, working it out, talking about the historical examples, and to then just throw something in there important and just say, oh, the founders just threw it in there, I don't think that that's an accurate interpretation of the Constitutional Convention. I believe that the reason why it wasn't discussed at great detail, like proportionate representation, is because it was something that they all were fine with. They agreed with it. For example, the 17th Amendment issue again, the direct election of senators. When it came to that exact question, that was hardly debated at all, because they all agreed that the state legislatures should appoint the senators. And so when you have issues that they didn't debate in detail, it's usually because they were all had a common consent and common understanding of something that should be the way it is. I think they left it totally open-ended because that's the point. The point is a provision in the Constitution to be able to bypass the federal government to amend the federal document. So you don't want something in the document that's all detailed, because you don't want the federal government to be able to come in and say, no, this is the rules, we're going to dictate it, we're in charge, you're doing it wrong. This is something that comes from the people in the states, not from the federal government. So
okay. Response from Senator, and then we'll go to Sandy.
I got a problem with, I have a problem. Bill says they bypassing Congress. That was specifically raised in the debates in the convention. And they specifically put in the first 2 words of Article 5 as the Congress. And they gave a role for Congress there, so there wouldn't be a bypassing of Congress, which is odd to say because they were trying to appease the anti-federalist movement. The other thing is the language. You will find all of the language that ended up coming out of the Committee of Style in the last 3 iterations of the Committee of Style, all contain the verbiage that was agreed on in those debates, those very limited debates that I mentioned, that took place in the convention. So I'm not saying that it was an afterthought. I'm just saying that it's interesting to me that James Madison is putting up some really serious concerns about the vagueness of Article 5, and then they all rolled over anyway on that.
Okay, Sandy, please. I would say Mark Levin's one of them. I mean, he wrote a book called The Liberty Amendments, and he's very popular among the grassroots. So I think he has instigated, and he talks about it on his radio program a lot. So I would say he's a big influence. There's another group called Convention of the States, which is a group that pushes for it. I think there's policy centers and think tanks that support it that have pushed for it. Those off the top of my head, I mean, I would say Mark Levin's a huge influence on the conservative side who's pushing for this.
So most of the stuff I've seen, it's coming from citizen groups, citizens.
It's coming from citizen groups, and Senator Long and I had a lengthy debate just a couple months ago about this issue.
My question is for everyone. While the debate is going on about Article 5, Senator, you mentioned something that you had been pushing in Congress. Was it a bill? If so, what was the number? Who was standing against it? And how can we help to get that pushed through in the interim?
Okay, first of all, I'm not in Congress, and I run state legislation, and I typically try to run my stuff through the budget so that
Well, you mentioned somebody had been standing in your way.
I can't recall exactly what you might be referring to.
You were talking about, this is my idea of how to do this rather than in Article 5. You've been working on it with several others?
Oh, okay. So, yeah, when I start talking about it, I'm talking about, I'll give you some specific ideas. For instance, I think you can simulate a repeal of the 17th Amendment. I think you can actually simulate a repeal of the 17th Amendment in your states. And I'll just give you the Arizona example. Number one, currently the state government actually pays for each party to hold an election to nominate their nominees. I have a major problem with that. That's not fair to anybody who's not a member of those parties. But secondly, you should be closing up the party primaries. Those nominating conventions. So I've proposed that. Standing in my way are the political parties. Okay. The other way you do that is you have a caucus system for your federal officials. And the best simulation you've seen of the 17th Amendment would be in Utah when they got rid of Bob Bennett and brought in Mike Lee. What happened? I've talked to delegates in Utah to the caucus system in Utah, and all of a sudden Bob Bennett, who had developed his life within the Washington, D.C. bubble and forgotten what Utah was like, he was on the phone with those people every night. He was coming home. Didn't work for him, but that's the point. You're trying to get your federal representatives to come home and talk to the people at home so you can simulate a 17th Amendment repeal. Obviously, it's a weak simulation, but nonetheless, that's one of the ideas, one of the prescriptives I have.
I have a statement and a question.
Okay, keep the statement brief, please, Joe.
I'm sorry?
I said keep the statement brief.
Why don't we know the answer before we allow a convention of states to become a reality? Why don't we have Tea Party patriots and other groups talk to their governors, talk to their state legislators, know just how many states we have behind this should it come to pass Congress, that we have 3/4 of the states that are going to get this quickly passed throughout the country. I mean, it seems to me that you need to know the answer before you ask the question.
Well, it depends what mechanism you're using and what you're proposing. Compact for America, for example, doesn't go to a convention, doesn't propose the amendment until you have that number that ratifies. It's all kind of a cascading conditional enactment, as Senator Biggs said correctly. Different other proposals, it just depends on how open-ended your convention that you're calling for, or your amending convention that you're calling for is, whether it's limited to specific text, specific subjects, or even more broadly considering anything that will limit government, or even more broadly considering anything, right? And so it just depends, and it also, the timelines change, because if it'll take 4 years, 5 years to get the whole process moving, well, that's a whole different set of state legislators you're going to be dealing with at the proposal stage, at the convention stage, at the ratification stage. If you're doing it via compact, it's kind of a turnkey. You pass it once, Congress passes it once, and you're done. So yeah, there's a lot of behind the scenes lobbying and machinations of what's being done, but you effectively don't really know who's on board until everyone's on board.
And if I can just dovetail, and I agree with Ilya that it's because it's something that takes time, and you have changing personnel, it's going to be really hard to predict. I have other issues with the compact, but I'll leave that for another time. But the other aspect to it, I think, that is critical is I'm not sure, in my opinion, that you can ever fully limit what goes on in a convention. For instance, in my state, we had a state representative introduce a piece of legislation that said any delegate selected to participate in an Article 5 convention would commit a felony if they voted for something other than specifically approved by the legislature. Now, think about that. That really makes for a deliberative convention, doesn't it? And so that's problematic. I mean, even Mr. Nadelson, Professor Nadelson, who I think contradicts himself on some of these issues on limitation and how you get there, he himself said that you can't do that. And I think his position is similar to mine in the sense that anything the legislature or even the citizenry does would be advisory towards the delegates. But the delegates have a tremendous amount of leeway. They have to be able to have leeway when you have such a convention, because otherwise you kill the deliberative process. You hamper the ability to get whatever product the delegates think is optimal out.
There's no constitutional definition of deliberative. Deliberative could mean an up or down vote. There's no requirement that the delegates have some sort of discretion to amend the text that they're voting on.
Well, that question has never been asked of the Supreme Court. I think that the very idea of having a convention implies that there's going to be some kind of deliberation. Otherwise, the convention becomes irrelevant if you have some kind of agreement beforehand before you go in.
Convention, quite literally, from the Latin convenio, means coming together. So delegates from all the different states come together to vote on something, or they come together to do something else. It doesn't imply any sort of debate or long term or any sort of processes. Those can all be written. The Constitution, for good or ill, leaves that open to however the organizing principle wants to be designed.
Okay, next question. Terry?
You brought it up in your opening remarks, and we've seen it time and time again. We're going through it again now. They don't follow the Constitution now. So even if you put in a balanced budget amendment, they're not going to follow the balanced budget amendment. They haven't produced a budget in 6 years. So why would the convention proposing an amendment do it and then have a president write an executive order that says you don't have to worry about having a balanced budget anyway, I'm going to do what I want?
Well, at a certain point, the politics sort of gets in the way of something like that. If there's enough political will that 3/4 of the states ratify a balanced budget amendment, presumably they'd be sending to Congress congressmen and senators who reflect that political will. If not right now, well, in 2 years, at the next election. And similarly with the president, it would be hard to see, 3/4 of the states ratifying such an amendment and then turning around and giving their electoral college votes to a president that is opposed to that. And so it's, you kind of are living in parallel worlds. If there's the political will to do good thing X, how can there simultaneously coexist the equivalent political will to do bad thing Y? I guess we are living in temporary gridlock now because of the way that the election cycles operate, and we have a polarized populace that hasn't really decided which way to go, which is fine. The gridlock is a feature, not a bug of our constitutional system. But if there's so much political will to ratify a constitutional amendment, which isn't a simple majority, then there should be the political will to actually then enforce it, and then you get judicial review, and you get a whole host of non-constitutional pressure points.
I think that particular view indicates, if we were to apply that to even Congress right now, we would say Congress ignores the laws, so why pass any more laws? Or the president ignores Congress, so why even have Congress? So I think when we ask that question, they ignore the Constitution already, so why even try to mess with it, I think is a surrender. Secondly, amendments have proven to be followed more than the actual body of the Constitution themselves. They seem to have more power because you have more. It's clear that there's more political will to do something, to pass an amendment, and so therefore it's a very clear dictate from the people, from the states, what the people want. The Bill of Rights. Some of the founders disagreed with the Bill of Rights because the Constitution doesn't need to have a Bill of Rights, they said, because it limits government, so they can't even abuse those rights. And so if we'd had that view back then, they would have said, we don't need to do that because the founders because the Constitution limits. But we still did it because we realized that we had to put a little bit of stronger emphasis on those specific rights. And so that's what an amendment process does. Whether Congress is ignoring the Constitution or not, whether the federal government's ignoring the Constitution or not, doesn't mean that we should surrender and say, let's not pass laws, let's not try to fix things.
I just go along with the senator there that at some point when we get the groundswell that we're trying to do better in place, where, you look at the last election, which was a wave, and GOP's taking all the credit for it, but they're still putting the same people in that surrender our rights and our freedoms as leadership. And so I'd rather see us get more people in there that believe and get a party that believes with what we're saying than to have a convention done, it get run away, and we end up with a whole bunch of stuff we didn't want in the first place.
That ends up being a temporary fix. Electing good people is something we should most definitely do, but it's a temporary fix because they will then be out of office as well. So we need structural things that protect us, not relying upon individuals that we send to Washington.
Okay, next we don't have a lot of time left, just about a minute or so. So
sure.
Congressman Nistook.
I have not heard a status report. Requests and petitions from state legislatures have been going on for decades, asking Congress to convene the Constitutional Convention to adopt a balanced budget amendment. If I'm correctly informed, I think Michigan, a year or so ago, became the threshold number of states to petition in that way. But I've not heard from any of you a status report of the process of petitions already sent by state legislatures to Congress on this topic.
My understanding of the history of it is that there's been over 700 applications in the 200 plus years, and Congress is ignoring it. Whether we agree with whether we should have an Article 5 or not, we should be furious that Congress is absolutely ignoring their job to call a convention when it's very clear that the threshold has been met numerous times in 200 plus years.
I think if the information I have is correct, is that Michigan was the 33rd state, and they're looking for a 34th state. And what's interesting is that some of the folks that come into my office tell me that Congress will need to determine the sufficiency of those applications. And I'm not sure that I buy that because I don't see how Congress has that authority, but in Article 5. But nonetheless, they're one state short, is what I've been told, with regard to at least one group's balanced budget proposal.
Okay, one last question from Michelle, and then each guest will have a 5-minute closing statement.
Okay, I've heard numerous times from numerous venues, and even from you, Bill, today, that
we agree the problem really isn't the Constitution, it's that our legislators won't follow it. So if you have a tumor in your hand, which could be the Congress, why would you cut out the heart? We need to use our energy, or don't we need to use our energy in finding out some way, some type of repudiation to force them to follow the Constitution?
I think that is the repudiation. I don't think that's cutting out the heart. I think it's strengthening the heart. That is the repudiation, the activity of the people. And whether the activity of the people results in a convention or not, just the process itself is having an effect already. I mean, we look at what we've done in 6 years, folks. We have changed the dialogue in Washington. There's no question that that's happened because of the activity of the people. And so this is just just a tool for the citizens to be more active and the states to be active. And I don't think it's cutting out the heart at all, whether we have a convention or not.
There is no balanced budget requirement in the Constitution. It seems like putting one in would push back on the growth of government, and therefore it's a good idea. Another good idea might be, Congress can only regulate interstate commerce. The Constitution already says that. That's been misinterpreted for 70 years. Let's put in a constitutional amendment defining interstate commerce as actually interstate commerce. It seems redundant, but maybe it needs saying because it's been misinterpreted for so many years. Similarly here, there's so much of the spending is unconstitutional, but rather than picking and choosing and saying, this department is amending the Constitution to abolish this department or that department or that department, you just put in a balanced budget that limits it altogether.
Okay, so we're going to go to the 5-minute closing. And very quickly, I just wanted to say the reason why we had this debate right now is because we're heading out of an election year cycle into a legislative cycle where people will be more focused on the legislatures than they will on elections. And so because there are groups pushing for this may come up in your states, and we just wanted to make sure that you had something from both sides. Tea Party Patriots will remain neutral on this because we are pretty much split. Our grassroots, every time we've polled on it, is pretty much split right down the middle, and it's very contentious, and TPP usually does not take a position when it's like that. So we're just presenting the information for you, and I'm not sure what order you guys would like to go in for your closing.
I'll go first.
Okay.
I'll leave him the last word. That's fine. When you have the better of the argument, you can leave the other guy the last word. Look, I'm for every way under the sun to limit the size of government, to enforce the Constitution, to secure and protect our liberties. So I'm not here to say that passing a balanced budget amendment or having a constitutional convention, an amendment convention more broadly, or more specifically using the Compact for America, will cure everything that ails America. There are other constitutional amendments that I would favor. There are lots of political moves, legislative moves at both the federal and state levels that I would favor. Appointing better judges at both the federal and state levels. There's lots of things to be done. I'm not arguing that, if I win this debate and everyone agrees with me on this particular point, that's it. Everybody in the country agrees with me on this particular point, we'll have solved everything. By no means. But limiting the ability of the federal government to spend and controlling it in a certain way such that when you approach the level where spending approaches revenues over a certain period, to allow the president to then impound, to require certain things, the balanced budget, would put incredible pressure on the federal government to keep within its fiscal means. And the best way of doing that is through a compact, which means that all states, we have compacts of all kinds, typically over ports and waterways, wherever states are bordering each other and they need to share resources. We have all the exchange of criminals, reciprocity in the criminal justice system. Those are all state compacts. This is nothing new. And the Compact for America has all the states that join it. Currently there are 2. There will be others. To agree on a certain type of language to limit federal spending. And when there are enough that convenes the convention to vote up or down with specific rules about who the delegates are, typically the governor of the state, assuming they're properly followed all the procedures, and they convene this 24-hour convention simply to vote for the legislation. Once they vote for the proposed amendment, once they vote for it, it's already pre-ratified. So it takes one vote in all of the legislatures, House and Senate, typically a joint resolution, and then one vote from Congress to approve the compact, because Congress has to approve all interstate compacts. Doesn't go to the president, and that's it. And you don't have an opportunity for either considering other types of amendments, although I could be in favor of them, the state veto of federal regulations. There are lots of other ideas. I encourage you to find out what non-balanced budget limited government amendments there are. There's no power to consider those, let alone things that those of us who are looking to take back the government would oppose. And there's no room for a runaway convention. And as I said, if there were one, that wouldn't be ratified. And if it were ratified, then we've already lost, and we should all go home and do something else. So my message to you is that I'm glad that an organization like this exists to consider a whole host of reforms at the state and federal level to empower and educate citizens and to consider different solutions to different problems. I'm not saying to you that a balanced budget amendment or the Compact for America's balanced amendment will fix all that ails America. I will say, though, that you shouldn't take constitutional amendments off the board for fears either of not being able to control delegates or not being able to control the amendments that are then passed. Thanks very much again for hearing me out. If you want ideas on particular policies to pursue across a whole host of areas, the Cato Institute is there for you, and in all of your states there are sister organizations, free market think tanks that are part of the state policy network. Some states have more than one. I've worked with most of them around the country over the years on a host of issues ranging from immigration and healthcare and judicial reform and fiscal policy. So think hard about this stuff, but whatever your nightmare scenario is not going to happen from this. Whatever your utopia scenario is not going to happen from this. It's taken a long, long time to get us to the condition where we're in. It's going to take a long time to get back, but you're taking the first steps. Thank you.
So first of all, I want to mention something I should have mentioned at the beginning, that I do not represent Tea Party patriots in these views. As Kelly just mentioned, Tea Party Patriots has taken a neutral stance on it, so we'll continue to be a resource organization when it comes to providing information about Article 5. And when we talked about doing Article 5 for this event, I wanted it to not just be my views or anybody else's views. That's why we thought a debate would be great, so we're getting multiple views. So that's really our goal as an organization. But having given that disclaimer, then I'll now provide you more of my evidence of why I think I'm right, of course. So one of the quotes that's used from people who disagree with an Article 5 is a quote from James Madison. And they say that James Madison disagreed with the convention. And so I always went right along with that quote, and I thought, well, boy, if Madison's my favorite founder. If he disagreed with the convention, then I probably should be leery of it as well. And that quote that's used, it says, if a convention were to take place, I should tremble for the result of a second. I should tremble for a result for my country, he said. Now, you'll notice I just read the very beginning of this and the very end of this. There's a huge body in the middle. And so I decided to go figure out what the little ellipses were, what the three dots were, what was missing. Madison trembles for fear for his country on the thought of a second, he says, general convention. See, there was a movement in New York. He wrote this letter literally only months after the Constitution was ratified, and it was still months before it actually took effect. So you need to put this in context, that the Constitution hadn't even been completely implemented yet. In Madison, there was a movement in New York where they wanted an entirely new General Convention. So he's not talking, when he says that, about an Article 5 convention. He's saying, I don't want a whole new convention because we just did it, and it was tough, and we barely squeaked by with something good. But Madison then goes on to talk, because what this friend was asking him in this letter is he's asking him, what do you think about some of these amendments that we should do, and what do you think about New York's movement with the general stuff? So when he talks about then the amendments, he said, there's some amendments that I think need to happen. But the first thing that we should do is let's give Congress the opportunity. We haven't given them the opportunity yet because Congress doesn't exist. Let's see what they can do. And if they can't do it, then let's go to the second method. So Madison wasn't against an Article 5 convention. He just simply said, let's let Congress try. In fact, he was the guy in Congress that tried. He's the one that put the Bill of Rights together, right? Then he talks about, and this is what I found so fascinating in this letter, he gives 3 methods of amending the Constitution. I'm thinking, what's Madison doing here? There's only 2. He wrote it. He should know. The 2 is Congress can propose an amendment, or this convention can propose an amendment, and then the states ratify it. But he gives a third. He says here, he says, it could be done by the unanimous consent of the parties who are bound by it. What is he talking about, I thought? And then he mentions if first principles are to be referred to. Now, first principles, when the founders talk about first principles, they're talking about our fundamental unalienable rights. Primarily, they're talking about the rights that are outlined in the Declaration of Independence. And so when he's talking about first principles, what's Madison talking about? So I go to the Declaration, and there it is. We have the right to establish, alter, and abolish our own form of government. Madison's saying, he actually says we could bypass the whole Constitution, and if we all agree unanimously to sit down and alter and abolish our form of government, we have that fundamental unalienable right. The Constitution was written, and we were able to put it into place because we have this unalienable right to establish, alter, and abolish. The Constitution did not eliminate that right to establish, alter, and abolish. It can't eliminate it because that's what gave it the power to be created. And so the created cannot overpower or destroy the creator. So we still, as a people, have the power to establish, alter, and abolish our form of government. And Madison says if we need to do it, then we should go back to those first principles. So we still have that right as a people. And we have that right and the ability. And I think that perhaps from time to time, as Jefferson said it in a pretty harsh way, but Jefferson essentially was saying we've got to go back from time to time and kind of reinvent ourselves and relook at that fundamental right. So I think that's what Article 5 really is an exercise of our right to establish, alter, and abolish our form of government if it is proven to be destructive to those rights. And I would venture to say that our government has become destructive to the rights of life, liberty, and property. And perhaps the time is right to have an Article 5 convention to bring that education to the people, enlighten the people, get them fired up. And I think that it would have a positive effect because it would be exercising federalism, and we would be exercising our position as the only censors of our government and the only keepers of our rights. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you. Thanks again so much for having me. It's rare for a debate to be able to go on as long as this is, maybe explore some of these thoughts and ideas as long as we have this morning. I'm really appreciative of it. Now, I want to speak briefly about the letter to George Tuberville that Bill was referring to from James Madison, written in response to a question by Tuberville regarding New York's request for a, quote, general convention. Tuberville was a Virginia planter. He had taken part of and was taking part in the Virginia Ratification Convention. And the word general at that time, if we're going to say let's take into
let's just take into account, I feel like Ed Sullivan on the old Ed Sullivan show, really shoot. If you take into account the meaning of a general convention at that time, it was not, quite frankly, according to Professor Nadelson anyway, who has written extensively on this, it was not the interpretation that my friend who just spoke, who's our moderate on the issue, that he were committed one way or the other, and then the Lord would not spew him out of his mouth for being in the middle. But when Nadelson says a general convention, it meant at that time was a convention of everybody affected, all the states affected. It didn't mean a reopening of every bit of the Constitution. It meant just a general convention so everybody would participate. That's one important point with regard to that. The other aspect that within those ellipses that is written is Madison gives about 8 reasons why he didn't want to see a convention opened up. He could have gone for an Article 5 process on the Bill of Rights, but instead he proposed during the first session of Congress repeatedly that they establish a Bill of Rights and send it to the states for ratification from Congress. He chose that method because he was concerned that there would be now people of heated passion, that there would be factions and special interests that had formed that would then try to attempt to change the very nature of the Constitution. And if you read it, you get a sense that Madison was prophetic because it sounds an awful lot about like what would happen if we had a convention today. And so that's important to understand. And so now this will really look awkward. To get back to my notes of what I wanted to close with, I'm going to put on my reading glasses and kind of stand like this. The other thing is it has been mentioned that we need to have a structural fix. Well, I say it unabashedly. I love the Constitution as it is today. I believe that is the structure, that if it were adhered to assiduously by those we elected, 95% of our problems would dissipate. As long as we keep electing people who do not adhere to the barriers that were established, then we'll continue to have problems. The efforts of Tea Party patriots and many other organizations is trying to turn that tide, to educate and to elect people who can effectively make change. Because if you change your structure, the people who, and you leave the people who ignore that structure in place, then it doesn't matter how many times you change the structure. I asked a fellow last week who came in, how high would you build the parchment barriers? And he couldn't say, but he wants them very high. The idea of a pre-ratification, think about that. We're going to have a compact so we can have a pre-ratification. That seems very awkward to me, and I expand on that since we've had a couple of public service announcements, I'll just say in my forthcoming book called The Con of the Con-Con, I do actually cover the pre-ratification problem. I'll just give you a nub of this whole thing. The reason I oppose it is the Constitution isn't the problem, it's the people the problem. We are the problem. We elect the wrong people. We have potentially severe negative consequences. I personally don't believe that the worst outcome you could have is what we have today. I think the worst outcome you could have could be significantly worse, far more progressive, far more statist. And I think we need to keep working to change and educate people. My prescriptions are you elect better people, people who understand the oaths of office. You continue to educate. You simulate the 17th Amendment. And then I'm going to just close with this last little bit. If we really want lasting change, we have got to make the sacrifices necessary of material, of standing in the community. We have to be able to take the abuse that comes for standing up and fomenting this movement. It took multiple generations to get off the course like we are. It will take at least one or two more generations to right the ship, but we can do it. I remember that to be a conservative was anathema. Now you find people like Barbara Boxer clinging to the term conservative because conservative is the way the American people want to be thought of. We want less government, fewer taxes, less regulation. That is the movement we're on today. I don't think we have to change the structure ultimately to correct the course we're on. We just need to keep working and fighting with folks like you and even Bill and Ilya, even though we disagree on this. We are all fighting to restore the freedoms in America. Again, thanks so much for letting me be with you.
Let's give all of our guests a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, very good.
Thank you so much to two of you and also to Bill. Okay, we are officially at lunchtime, I believe.